They exiled her for speaking the truth. Now she holds the mic that the world listens to. When Olive dared to challenge the patriarchy in her pastor father's church, she was cast out and branded the family disgrace. Years later, she returns. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to speak at the Vatican, exposing everything they tried to bury. This is not just revenge, it's resurrection. From the outside, the Morgan household looked like a pristine example of suburban success. A white-pillared colonial on a tree-lined street in Charleston, South Carolina. But behind its polished facade, secrets festered like mold beneath the floorboards. And Olive Morgan, the youngest daughter of Reverend Charles Morgan and his devout wife Martha, had learned early that appearances meant everything, especially when truth threatened to dismantle the illusion. At 16, Olive already knew she wasn't like her siblings. Where Bridget led church choirs and quoted scripture with piety, and Jamal studied theology at Duke with his eyes on the pulpit, Olive painted murals in alleys and wrote slam poetry about hypocrisy in high places. That divergence was tolerated, barely, until she won a citywide essay contest titled Faith, Feminism, and Freedom. Her essay questioned the role of patriarchy in church leadership. It was published online. Then it went viral, and then everything changed. Reverend Morgan's phone rang. Nonstop. Church elders expressed concern. Donors threatened to pull funding. Congregants whispered in pews. Olive wasn't just a rebellious teenager anymore. She was a threat. The next Sunday, Olive was called into her father's study. The room reeked of tobacco and old books. Her mother stood silently behind him, hands clasped in quiet fury. "You've embarrassed this family," her father began, voice trembling with rage. "We raised you better than this." "All I did was write the truth," Olive replied, voice even. "Isn't that what sermons are supposed to do?" Her father's hand hit the desk. "You will retract that essay, publicly, or you'll no longer be welcome in this home. I'd rather leave than lie." So she left. With just a suitcase, her laptop, and a scholarship deferred from Howard University, Olive moved in with her godmother Lillian in Atlanta. The transition wasn't smooth. At first, she struggled with imposter syndrome, financial stress, and the lingering ache of familial rejection. But in time, she began rebuilding herself from the ashes. She worked nights at a 24-hour diner, flipping pancakes for minimum wage while editing local freelance assignments during her breaks. She volunteered at community centers, learning how to listen as much as she spoke. Slowly, she started finding pieces of herself: quiet confidence, resilience, clarity. By 21, Olive enrolled at Howard. She double-majored in digital media and social justice. Her poetry became sharper, her commentary more fearless. Professors noted her dangerous compassion, a phrase Olive wore like armor. At 24, Olive launched a digital magazine, Echo, spotlighting youth voices suppressed by tradition, culture, or control. The magazine featured essays from queer teens in conservative towns, Muslim girls in hijabs speaking on gender justice, and survivors of purity culture finding their voice. The publication grew slowly, then exponentially, after a viral video essay Olive released titled The Black Sheep's Sermon. The piece deconstructed the concept of obedience as love in toxic family systems. It wasn't just a takedown, it was a call to action. Within weeks, she was interviewed by NPR, featured on Teen Vogue, and received a private message from Ava DuVernay praising her vision. Olive couldn't believe it. Still, a part of her hesitated to feel proud. She knew the cost of her voice. Every time she opened her inbox, there were messages from anonymous critics, some using Bible verses as knives. And then one day, she received an email with a name that made her stomach drop. From Bridget Morgan. Subject: "You went too far, Olive. You need to stop airing family business to strangers. You're ruining Dad's reputation. Come home. Apologize. Or at least, stay quiet. This is not how you heal." Olive stared at the screen. It took her 3 hours to respond. "You never saw the wound. Don't tell me how to bandage it." When Olive was invited to speak at the Youth Justice Summit in Rome, it was validation, but also a reckoning. She hadn't been back to any global stage since her exile. Now, she would be on panels with diplomats and cultural leaders. As she rehearsed her speech, Olive couldn't help but reflect on the irony. The girl once told to shut up in Sunday school was now lecturing global leaders on systemic silence. Her godmother Lillian helped her pack. "You ready for this?" she asked. "No," Olive said, then smiled. "Which means I have to go." Before the flight, Olive visited an old bookstore she used to frequent in Atlanta. She left a copy of her essay, hand-bound and signed, in the Feminist Studies section, tucking it between Audre Lorde and bell hooks. It felt symbolic. On the plane, she sat with her journal open, scribbling lines of what would eventually become her keynote. Truth is not rebellion. It's return. A return to the self before it was silenced. A return to love that does not require erasure. As the clouds parted over Rome, Olive stared out the window, not in awe of the city's grandeur, but in reverence for the girl who refused to stay small. Rome was a city carved in contradictions. Ancient ruins resting beneath sleek architecture, cobblestone streets leading to neon-lit alleys. Olive stepped off the plane and inhaled deeply, the air tangy with jet fuel and possibility. Her heels clicked over marble tiles at Leonardo da Vinci International Airport, echoing louder in her head than they did in the terminal. The Youth Justice Summit was hosted at a sprawling conference center just off the Tiber River. Banners reading, "Voices of Tomorrow" fluttered in the early spring breeze. Olive was scheduled for day 2, a keynote titled "Reclaiming the Pulpit When Silence is Violence." But it wasn't the speech that made her nervous. It was the whispers. Olive had noticed the pattern. Whenever she took a stage, someone from her past emerged. Not always malicious, sometimes curious, sometimes repentant, but always destabilizing. She didn't fear confrontation. What unsettled her was the emotional residue. You think you've cleaned the wound, but grief has layers. Her first panel was moderated by a Brazilian activist named Camila da Costa, a trans rights advocate whose bravery Olive had long admired. They hit it off immediately, talking over espresso. After the session, "You're not what I expected," Camila said, stirring sugar into her cup. "Neither are you," Olive smiled. "You're louder. I like it." They laughed. Camilla tapped her spoon against the porcelain edge. "Just be careful. Some of these delegates aren't ready for your kind of honesty." They weren't ready for Jesus either. Camilla let out a laugh that startled nearby diners. "Touché." The night before Olive's keynote, she wandered through the Trastevere district, where street performers juggled under lamplight and accordion music danced through alleyways. She needed the distraction. The email had arrived that morning from Reverend Charles Morgan. Subject: "A father's grief, Olive. It's not too late to come home. Your mother is sick. Stress mostly. She cries when she sees you on television. Do you want your mother to fall ill over a speech? You used to be such a sweet girl. Don't let strangers convince you otherwise. Come home." Her fingers hovered over her phone keyboard all night, but she typed nothing. Olive knew the tactic. Make your freedom feel like a crime. Make your strength feel like betrayal. She remembered the last time her mother cried. It wasn't when Olive left. It was when Olive refused to wear a dress to Easter service at 15. She'd shown up in slacks and a black button-down. Her mother clutched her pearls so hard they snapped. The day of her keynote arrived. She wore a dark green suit, her dreadlocks pulled into a high bun, a single silver pin on her lapel that read, "Loud." The auditorium was packed. Lights dimmed. Cameras rolled. The moderator introduced her with a summary of Echo, her magazine, and the Black Sheep's sermon. She stepped up to the podium. Olive took a breath. "I was told obedience is the highest virtue," she began. "But what happens when obedience means agreeing to your erasure?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Not the disinterested kind. The holding your breath kind, she went on, weaving stories from her childhood, anecdotes from Echo contributors, and data on the mental health toll of spiritual shame. She quoted bell hooks, James Baldwin, and even her father's sermons. "I still believe in God," she said, "but not the God who watches a girl shrink to fit a pew. I believe in the God who flipped tables, who welcomed the outcasts, who said, 'You will do greater things than these.'" Standing ovation. Cameras flashed. social media exploded. A young Pakistani poet tweeted, "Olive Morgan just baptized the room in fire." Back at the hotel, Olive exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Camilla knocked on her door later that evening, holding a bottle of Italian wine. "To righteous noise," Camilla toasted. "To kindred rebels." Olive clinked glasses. That night, Olive opened her laptop and found 3 new emails from young women around the world. "Your speech gave me the courage to finally come out. To my family, my pastor read your article and called me to apologize. I want to start my zine. How did you begin?" She replied to everyone, but Rome held one last surprise. On her final day, walking past the Vatican walls, Olive saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside a small chapel, her sister Bridget. "You have fans," Bridget said without standing. "Did Dad send you?" Bridget shook her head. "I came on my own." They sat in silence, the buzz of scooters filling the space between them. "You broke us," Bridget said finally. "We were already broken," Olive replied. "I just stopped pretending." "So what now?" Olive looked toward the chapel, then back to her sister. "Now I keep telling the truth, even when it shakes the altar." Later, on the flight home, Olive penned another essay, "Faith Without Chains, Why I Spoke." She ended it with a line she hadn't dared say aloud until now. "To be a black sheep in a flock that fears change isn't exile, it's evolution." Rome glistened in the morning sun like an ancient secret waiting to be heard. Olive Morgan stood before the grand marble entrance of the Palazzo dei Congressi, a building that once housed the fascist ideologies of a broken past and now echoed with the voices of change. Delegates in tailored suits, translators with earpieces, and journalists with cameras buzzed around her. But Olive, dressed in a crisp indigo suit and sneakers, stood calm, grounded, and impossibly ready. Her keynote at the Youth Justice Summit was scheduled for 10 a.m., and her name had been printed alongside global changemakers. It wasn't lost on her that she was still the youngest on the panel. She thought about 16-year-old Olive, timid, exiled, and silenced. And then she thought of the letter she wrote to herself after her first year in Atlanta. "One day, your voice will be louder than their judgment." Today was that day. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with quiet excitement. Olive took a seat in the green room, organizing her notes, though she barely needed them. She had rehearsed this speech 100 times. Still, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything it meant. A volunteer peeked through the door. "Miss Morgan, you're on in 5. Olive nodded, rose, and straightened her shoulders. As she walked on stage, a standing ovation greeted her. Cameras flashed, people whispered. She took her place behind the podium, glanced at her speech, and then pushed it aside. "I was told to write a keynote," she began, "but my life has taught me to speak from the wound, not the page." The audience leaned in. "I was raised in a family where silence was sacred and obedience was the cost of love. But I've come to learn that true justice, personal and political, begins with breaking those silences. This is not rebellion. This is restoration." She spoke of systemic erasure, generational trauma, and reclaiming voice. She quoted Audre Lorde, bell hooks, and her essays. She ended with a simple line, "Being the black sheep saved my life." The room erupted. That night, her DMs overflowed. News clips circulated, hashtags trended, Black Sheep Rise, Olive Morgan, Voice Eyes Power. But nestled between congratulations and collaboration offers, there was one message that stopped her heart. From Rev. Charles Morgan. Subject: "Come home, Olive, I watched your speech. I don't agree with everything you said, but I see now I never listened long enough to understand you. Your mother's sick. She's asking for you. Please come home." For a full hour, Olive stared at the message. Then she closed her laptop and began to weep. Returning to Charleston wasn't triumph. It was a test. When she arrived, the house looked unchanged, pristine, posed. But Olive was different now. Her father met her at the door, older and quieter. Her mother lay in a hospice bed in the living room, frail but alert. "Hi, baby," her mother whispered. Olive's throat tightened. She reached out and held her mother's hand. There was no apology, no long discussion, just presence. Sometimes, forgiveness starts there. That evening, Olive sat with her father on the porch. "I should have protected you," he said, "but I was more afraid of the church than of losing my daughter." "You did lose me," Olive replied gently. "But I came back for her, not for your redemption." He nodded, accepting. It was a start. A week later, at her mother's memorial, Olive stood before a crowd of churchgoers, family, and old neighbors. She wore a simple black dress and carried no script. "My mother taught me many things: how to make lavender tea, how to fold napkins for guests, how to walk away from noise with grace. But the most important thing she taught me was this: sometimes love means letting someone go far enough to find themselves." She paused. "I found myself." And as she stepped down from the altar that once silenced her, Olive smiled. She wasn't the black sheep anymore. She was the shepherd now.